Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to be taking a look at time period 6, which we refer to as the Gilded Age when we did it in class. So we're still looking kind of at the late 1800s here. We're going to be looking region by region, so starting in the south and then working our way up to the north, and we're going to look economic, social, and political. So that might be a good way to organize your notes, to set up a chart for economic, social, and political. You're going to go through each region in those three different categories. So we're going to start with the South. So the term that they use to describe the South is the New South, because this is post-Reconstruction, so certain things are changing in the South, certain things are not changing. So what you want to think about are what are big changes, in what areas are they changing? Are they changing economically, socially, politically? And what is staying as far as continuities are concerned in the South? And does this label, the New South, actually fit? So, first thing that's happening is they are developing some limited industry and infrastructure. So comparatively to the North in the same time period, it's not very extensive at all, but it's much more than the antebellum South had. So two industries that start to develop in the South is tobacco, as far as the production of cigarettes and other tobacco products, and then textiles. And if you look at those two industries, they make sense. The South grows extensive amount of tobacco. They also grow an extensive amount of cotton. And so it makes sense that they would kind of go into the manufacturing aspect of these industries. The other thing that you start to see develop in the South is some railroad development. So if you remember, pre-Civil War, antebellum South has very limited railroad development. But now they're starting to build some infrastructure. So that's partially due to Reconstruction and the people that Southerners would call carpetbaggers coming down and investing in the South and building railroads throughout the South. But also some of this happens in the New South time period. And so you start to see cities developing, more interior cities in the South, and being linked into the infrastructure. Now, at the same time, what's also happening, though, is the expansion of this idea of sharecropping that we talked about in our last time period. So in the beginning, this is something that the Freedmen's Bureau oversees to try and help transition newly freedmen into some kind of economic position in the Southern economy during Reconstruction, and also to help the planters. But after the end of Reconstruction in 1877, you're going to see the proliferation of sharecropping, and not just African Americans are going to be involved in it. A lot of yeoman farmer white Southerners are going to get kind of dragged into the process of the process of sharecropping as well. And if you look here, what really happens here is a lot of people get stuck in this cycle of debt, which causes a cycle of poverty and continuation of sharecropping throughout the South. Now, if you look at the region that sharecropping is really extensive, this blue on the map here, that's the old Black Belt region from the antebellum period. Same places where slavery was really dominant is the same places where you're going to see sharecropping be dominant. And it's very much tied to cotton. Okay, so when you look at this time period, cotton is still the dominant crop of the time period, and still the dominant crop that is being grown. Even more so in this time period than earlier time period, they're going to be even more reliant on cotton production because cotton is a form of currency, it's a form of credit, and it's a form of wealth in the society. And so it's a very prevalent crop that's being grown, and just as extensive as it was in the antebellum period. Just the method is going to be different. Now, politically speaking, when you look at the South, the term that we used to describe it was the Solid South. And what that meant was the Democratic Party is going to take hold over the South, and it's solidly voting for the Democratic Party continuously, not just through this Gilded Age time period, but into the early 1900s, all the way up until the 1950s. They're going to be solidly Democratic. And if you look at, this is a Southern interpretation of Reconstruction and then the New South. So Reconstruction they looked at as like a burden, having to carry this burden of the federal government being too involved in the South. And then if you look at this time period, this is the New South time period in their eyes. And this is kind of where they believe the South is really rejuvenating itself and kind of revitalizing itself. So this is definitely a white Southerner's viewpoint, a Democrat's probably viewpoint of what's happening here in the South. Now, how did the Democratic Party gain so much power over the South? Well, really, they're limiting the major Republican constituency in the South from exercising their right to vote. So you have a massive campaign to disenfranchise African Americans. So the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction really solidifies African Americans' right to vote within the country. But Southerners, what a lot of southern states are able to do is kind of roll back these rights. And what they do it is they kind of do it through really creative means to kind of go around the 15th Amendment. And so they pass poll taxes, which are taxes that you had to pay at the polls, which disproportionately affects African Americans because they're more likely to be in poverty than white Americans. You had literacy tests that tested if you could read and if you could understand difficult clauses from the Constitution to limit who could vote in these different states. And you also had grandfather clauses, which could grandfather somebody in whose parents could vote, or grandparents, excuse me, could vote prior to the Civil War. And therefore, if you could fall in that category, you didn't have to pass any of these tests. And so a lot of white Americans can fall into this category and be grandfathered into voting. Now, at the same time that they're limiting African Americans' political rights, they're also limiting African Americans socially. So what you see develop in this time period is the idea of institutionalized segregation. And this is segregation by law, which becomes pervasive throughout the South. And this is challenged, in the court system. And the famous court case that challenges it is Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson is that segregation is legal, and they kind of set the precedent of separate but equal. And so famously this is overturned with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, almost about 60 years later. But what this does is it creates a time period of legalized segregation throughout the American South. And so that it's segregation by law, which is a little bit different than what was going on in the North. In the North, you have more of a de facto segregation developing, where it's not segregation by law, but it's segregation by custom and culture. Now, you have two major civil rights leaders who are trying to combat some of the different injustices they see African Americans being forced to take on during the New South time period. And they have two different divergent philosophies about how to do this. So the two famous civil rights leaders are W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. So Du Bois's idea is something called the talented tenth. And in this, he basically puts forth the idea that he believes the top 10th of African Americans, you should push them to excel to their highest degree and try and get them to go to advanced degrees and advanced colleges and push them to open up businesses. And his philosophy is that his talented 10 could then help to pull up the other 90% to help to employ them. And so that African Americans could be relying on other African Americans, and it's that top 10's job to try and help out the African American community and maybe provide jobs and provide a professional class for African Americans. Now, Booker T. Washington has a very different perspective. He believes in this idea of first off, accommodating to segregation. And his belief here is that once African Americans prove their worth to white society through free labor and through hard work, they're going to gain their equality in that way. And his mindset is that African Americans should try and get professions that can help them to gain a craft and to gain a skill and to improve their lives now. So he pushes for vocational skills like carpentry and other skills of that nature to try and get African Americans to have a skill to be employable, and that'll help them to move up the economic ladder. So two very different ideas here. Booker T. Washington lays out his idea in a speech known as the Atlanta Compromise speech. And a famous line from it, he's telling African Americans to cast down your buckets, meaning stay in the South and show your ability to improve yourself and get vocational education, and you will be able to move up the social ladder. Du Bois, on the other hand, he's going to be a founder of the NAACP, which is more of an advocate for civil disobedience and not really accommodating to segregation, which you'll see like later civil rights leaders take on similar ideas like Martin Luther King. Okay, so what we're going to continue with the last part of the screencast is the West. So in the West, really we're going to take a look at is the development of basically a new region within the United States. So the New West is going to see a lot of these areas become states in the time period. So all these states that you see labeled here are during the Gilded Age. A lot of them are going to become states. So Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Wyoming. they're all going to achieve statehood during this time period. So America is really kind of, we've conquered the land with Manifest Destiny. Now we're kind of fulfilling the settlement of a lot of these places out west in the Gilded Age. So big changes are happening as far as the western part of the United States. Now, one of the things that's kind of facilitating the economic growth of the West is the building of transcontinental railroads throughout the nation. And what you're seeing here is, massive railroads being built across the country, and that helps to develop economically these areas. But what's also happening is that the federal government is making these land grant deals with railroad companies because it's very expensive and it wouldn't really be worthwhile for a lot of private railroad companies to build these transcontinental railroads. So what the federal government's doing is offering them huge expanses of land next to the railroads to basically entice them to build these massive transcontinental railroads. And during certain time periods, this becomes very corrupt. And these railroad companies and these different congressmen are kind of like buying and buying stock and trading stocks with each other, and simply it leads to a lot of corruption on the federal government's level. Okay, now the other thing that's was really happening out here is people are moving out to these different areas. So you have famous acts like the Homestead Act during the Civil War. That stays in effect after the Civil War to kind of entice Americans to move out to these new developing regions. And really this is going to be the ending of two real eras here. So the end of the open range, because what's going to happen is a lot of farmers are going to move out to the Midwest, these western states, and start to develop it as agricultural areas. And the other thing that's really kind of coming to an end here is this idea of the frontier. So you have a famous thesis that's written by a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, and essentially it's known as the frontier thesis. And what Frederick Jackson Turner states is that America's identity is tied into this expansion westward, and he kind of sees the final settlement of the West as the end of this era in American history, and something that was quintessential that made Americans, this expansion westward and this ever pushing boundary of moving west. Now, in order to achieve this, the United States government had to engage in wars against the remaining Indian tribes out in the western territories. And so one of the major Indian tribes that's out there in the western Great Plains area are the Sioux. And so the U.S. government is going to fight different wars against the Sioux and other Indian tribes out in the west in order to finish the conquering of the western United States. And so from an Indian perspective, this is kind of seen as another great tragedy, again kind of being pushed off their land, and in this time being pushed into these places called reservations. So reservations, again, are a very unique American thing. So if you look out in the West, this map is showing you different Native American reservations out in the western half of the United States. And these are pretty expansive pieces of land, but what they are is basically like separate Indian nations within the American nation, and they're separate lands set apart for different Indian tribes. And so they're moving Native Americans into these different reservation areas from where their traditional territory, traditional land might have been. So again, this is like another form of segregation to a certain extent, because they're segregating Native Americans away from the larger white population moving out to these western lands. Now, at the same time, they're also trying to Americanize the Indians, and you see that through trying to convince them to send their children to American schools, trying to convince them to adopt farming techniques, and so there's a whole push to try and Americanize the Native American population during the Gilded Age time period. Okay, so that's going to kind of really wrap us as far as what's going on politically, economically, and socially in both the West and the South. So remember, again, with all of these screencasts, these are overviews, and it's just kind of meant to refresh your memory of a lot of big topics. It's up to you to take each of these topics and go a little bit deeper, find extra information, find more concrete details to kind of flesh out your ideas and your arguments on each of the different eras and each of the different topics. So with part 2 of the screencast, we're going to try and go into the northern industrialization and develop that socially, politically, and economically.